The nightmare begins. A small town in Ohio gripped with fear. It was the kind of winter that settled deep into your bones, where streets lay silent under a bleak gray sky, and even the warmest homes couldn't shake the cold outside. In the small unassuming town of Edgefield, Ohio, life usually moved at a languid pace, residents trusting in the safety that came with familiarity. But in the winter of 1997, this quiet town would lose its innocence. It began on a particularly bitter January evening, the kind that drove people indoors early. Brenda Anderson, a 28-year-old kindergarten teacher, had just finished packing up groceries after a long week. The parking lot of Miller's Market, dimly lit and shrouded in shadows, was nearly empty. The hum of her car's engine wasn't enough to mask the sound of faint footsteps echoing behind her. Turning quickly, all she saw was darkness before everything went silent. Her body was found hours later by a store clerk taking trash to the dumpsters. The scene was nothing short of horrific. Unimaginable violence. Brenda hadn't just been murdered, she had been mutilated. A small metal thermos was left by her side, its polished surface almost pristine compared to the surrounding brutality. The contents of that thermos? A grotesque signature of a crime that no one in Edgefield could fathom. News of the murder spread like wildfire. Edgefield, nestled in a part of Ohio known for calm winters and a tight-knit community, was suddenly thrust into terror. The details were too grisly to be entirely revealed to the public, but whispers began circulating about the thermos. People speculated wildly, theories growing darker as shock turned to fear. Brenda's death wasn't just tragic, it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. What unnerved most was the randomness of it all. Brenda wasn't a person with enemies nor someone living a high-risk lifestyle. She was every bit a representation of the town's values, hard-working, kind, always ready with a smile for her students. Her murder shattered that idyllic image of Edgefield, transforming its quiet streets into pathways of paranoia. The local police, headed by Chief Raymond Holden, were used to handling petty thefts, an occasional domestic dispute, and speeding citations. This, however, was far beyond anything they had ever faced. As Holden later admitted, "We weren't just searching for a murderer, we were on the trail of someone monstrous, someone who didn't see their victims as human at all." Calls poured in from the townsfolk, each claiming to have seen someone suspicious, but amid the chaos, no solid leads surfaced. By mid-January, the quiet dread that had seeped into Edgefield turned into full-blown hysteria. Parents imposed curfews on their children, women stopped shopping alone or walking at night, businesses adjusted their hours, closing earlier than usual, the once bustling diner now nearly empty after dusk. Yet, beneath the surface of this growing fear lay a chilling realization: it wasn't over. Whatever had claimed Brenda's life would strike again. Edgefield wasn't prepared for what came next. A small, working-class town, it didn't have the infrastructure or the experience to handle a situation this brutal and complex. The police department called in FBI profilers, seeking help to understand the mind of a killer who had evaded them while brazenly leaving behind a twisted trophy. The only certainty was that whoever did this was methodical, confident, and highly disturbed. The first murder, a grocery store parking lot, turns into a crime scene. It had been an ordinary Friday evening when Brenda Anderson decided to stop by Miller's Market, a small family-owned supermarket that had served Edgefield, Ohio for decades. The store was a staple in the community. Everyone shopped there, caught up on local gossip, and exchanged pleasantries with old acquaintances. Brenda, a beloved kindergarten teacher known for her warm smile and nurturing spirit, was no stranger to the aisles of Miller's. That night, however, the warm familiarity of the store felt unusually cold. Winter had arrived with full force, blanketing the town in biting wind and an oppressive quiet. The streets were eerily empty, save for the sound of occasional tires crunching over icy asphalt. The market's fluorescent glow spilled dimly onto the parking lot, creating long, distorted shadows that danced in the wind. Brenda carried 2 paper bags of groceries, her breath visible in the freezing air as she walked briskly to her car. Her Chevrolet sedan was parked near the back in one of the darker corners of the lot. She liked the privacy, it felt safer than being too close to the main road. That night, though, it was a fateful decision. As she placed the bags in the trunk and fumbled for her car keys, a faint sound caught her attention. Footsteps. Faint but unmistakable, crunching rhythmically against the frozen ground. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. Nothing. It was just her imagination, she told herself, or maybe another late-night shopper. She shook off the unease, her cheeks flushed from the bitter cold. The footsteps grew louder, and closer. Brenda turned sharply this time, but all she saw was darkness and the barren rows of parked vehicles. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking slightly, the sound dissipating into the still air. There was no answer, only an uncanny silence. Moments later, when she reached for her car door, the world behind her erupted into chaos. A heavy blow landed at the base of her skull, disorienting her, and she crumpled to the ground. The last thing Brenda felt was the ice's unforgiving chill against her face before total darkness enveloped her. The discovery. It wasn't until early the next morning that an employee scheduled for the early shift stumbled upon the gruesome scene. Todd Sanders, a stock clerk at Miller's, had taken a shortcut behind the building to discard some trash. As he approached the dumpster near the back corner of the parking lot, he froze. Right there, beneath the pale dawn light, was a figure sprawled across the ground. "Brenda?" he whispered, recognizing her brightly colored scarf. But something was terribly wrong. The puddle of dark, congealed liquid beneath her told him everything he needed to know before he even got closer. Todd dropped the trash bag he was carrying and stumbled backward, panic setting in. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone. 911, what is your emergency?" came the calm voice on the other end. There's a body here. It's Brenda Anderson. Oh my God, she's dead." Within minutes, police cars converged on the small parking lot, their red and blue lights cutting through the grim grayness of dawn. Officers secured the area with yellow tape, keeping curious onlookers at bay as detectives crouched close to examine Brenda's lifeless body. The scene Brenda's murder was shocking not just for its brutality, but for its chilling precision. Her neck displayed ligature marks, her cardigan was torn, and her once bright scarf was drenched in blood. But the most disturbing part wasn't immediately visible, until investigators spotted an object placed neatly beside her body. A small metallic thermos lay on the ground, gleaming in the early daylight like some kind of macabre trophy. Detective Lisa Howard, one of Edgefield's most seasoned investigators, approached the thermos cautiously, gloved hands shaking slightly. She unscrewed the lid, dreading what might be inside. When the contents revealed themselves, she recoiled, masking her horror with a cold, professional demeanor. Inside the thermos was human tissue. The realization hit hard. The monster they were dealing with hadn't just killed Brenda but had methodically mutilated her body. "What the hell is this?" whispered Officer Jim Bennett, his face pale as he gazed over Lisa's shoulder. "I don't know," she replied, her voice edged with quiet anger. "But this isn't your average murder. This is something else entirely." The town reacts. By the afternoon, word had spread like wildfire through Edgefield's tight-knit community. The usually quiet diner became the hub of hushed horror as townsfolk swapped details, some true, most exaggerated, about Brenda's murder. Was it a robbery gone wrong? No, people said. Her wallet and keys were untouched. Was it someone she knew, or worse, was it random? The uncertainty magnified the fear. Edgefield was a place where people rarely locked their doors, where the biggest news on any given day might involve a lost dog or a pie contest. Now, the town found itself at the heart of a mystery that felt like something straight out of a horror film. Parents began imposing curfews on their children. Women refused to go grocery shopping alone, and those who lived alone double-checked their locks every night. Miller's Market, usually a bustling hub of friendly chatter, emptied out after sundown. But for all the whispers and wild theories, one question loomed larger than any other: who would do something like this? As Brenda's friends and family mourned her death, Edgefield's law enforcement scrambled to piece together the fragments of evidence. They swabbed for DNA, combed through security footage, what little there was, and questioned everyone who had set foot near Miller's that evening. But even as they searched, one terrifying truth hung over them like a storm cloud. This was only the beginning. The next victim, the cafe manager who never made it home. Maria Gonzalez wasn't the type of person who went unnoticed. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her warm smile and approachable demeanor making her a beloved figure in the community. She managed the town's only 24-hour cafe, the Redwood Bean, a cozy spot tucked along Main Street that was famous for its coffee and late-night pies. If you stopped in for a midnight cup of joe, there was a good chance Maria would be there, greeting regulars by name and checking on the night staff with her characteristic kindness. That made her disappearance all the more chilling. It was a Wednesday night in late January, just 2 weeks after Brenda Anderson's brutal murder had rocked the town of Edgefield. The tension that had blanketed the small Ohio community showed no signs of receding, and for good reason. People locked their doors earlier. Streets that were once alive with chatter after dark now fell deathly quiet. And though the police were tight-lipped about the details of Brenda's case, the whispers about mutilation, about a thermos found at the scene, swept through the town like wildfire. Maria wasn't oblivious to the fear spreading among her neighbors, but she had always been practical. She reassured her staff and friends, telling her co-workers that the cafe's well-lit environment felt safe enough. Despite her confidence, she had started watching her surroundings more carefully on her nightly walks home to her small apartment just a few blocks away. That night, Maria's shift had gone as usual. Customers came and went, some settling into booths with their laptops, others grabbing coffee to go. Around 10:45 p.m., she waved off the last group of patrons lingering at the counter, her soft laughter echoing as they exchanged their goodbyes. She stayed behind a little longer than usual, double-checking that the closing registers reconciled. It had been a late night, and Maria looked forward to curling up with a book after a long day spent attending to customers and keeping things running smoothly. "See you tomorrow, boss," her barista called out as they left, leaving Maria alone in the darkness of the cafe. She didn't know it at the time, but she wouldn't see another morning. The final walk. Maria locked up at 11:25 p.m., turning onto the quiet main street, her breath misting in the freezing air. The snow from earlier that day had turned into a slick sheen of ice across the sidewalks. The crunch of her boots echoed down the empty street as the light from the cafe's neon sign flickered off behind her. Just 3 blocks. That's all Maria had to walk to reach the safety of her second-floor apartment. But those 3 blocks stretched longer than usual that night. A truck idled at the corner, its headlights casting ethereal beams through the mist. Other than that, the neighborhood seemed abandoned. Maria adjusted the strap of her purse and quickened her pace, unaware that something or someone was shadowing her. Somewhere near the second block, Maria heard what she thought was the sound of footsteps. She stopped, her heart quickening as she dared a glance over her shoulder. The icy stretch behind her was empty. Relief washed over her as she shook her head, laughing quietly to herself. "Get a grip, Maria," she muttered. She was almost home when it happened. A figure materialized from the shadows, quick and deliberate, a sudden blur of movement. Before Maria could scream, a heavy, gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, thrashing against a force that was overwhelming in its precision. Her purse fell to the ground with a thud, scattering her wallet and keys. What happened next would leave investigators horrified. The discovery. The next morning it was a sanitation worker who found her. On his routine run through a dimly lit alleyway that separated 2 local shops, he stopped short when his flashlight caught a flash of color, a shoe, half buried against the frozen slush. He moved closer and saw the mangled shape of a body collapsed against the wall. "Jesus," he whispered, stumbling backward before grabbing his radio. "Dispatch, there's a person here, I think she's dead." When officers arrived minutes later, it didn't take long for them to piece together who the victim was. Maria Gonzalez's body lay crumpled against the side of the dumpster, her once cheerful scarf now soaked in deep crimson. Her clothes had been torn in ways that suggested a brutal struggle. But as shocking as the scene was, the item placed beside her body struck fear into the responding officers' hearts. A stainless steel thermos, eerily similar to the one left at Brenda Anderson's crime scene. "Not again," Officer Terry King muttered under his breath, turning away briefly to compose himself. Detective Lisa Howard, still recovering from the brutal details of the first murder, took charge. She crouched down next to the thermos, her expression unreadable. The lid was screwed on tightly, just like before. With gloved hands, she unscrewed it, already dreading what she would find. The sight inside confirmed her worst fears, a sight that no amount of training could prepare anyone for. "It's him," she said quietly. "It has to be the same guy." The town in shock. Maria's murder sent ripples of shock and fear through Edgefield. If Brenda's case had unsettled the town, Maria's death completely unraveled whatever sense of security anyone had left. "Not Maria," friends and co-workers said in disbelief. She was always so careful. The cafe, once a bustling refuge for late-night souls, shuttered its nighttime hours indefinitely. Customers and staff alike left flowers and candles by the door, turning the Redwood Bean into an impromptu memorial. For women across town, the message was clear: you are not safe. Though the police still refrained from releasing full details, the thermos found at the second scene confirmed what residents already feared. Edgefield was in the grip of a serial killer, one who wasn't afraid to strike in the heart of the community. Maria's closest friends described her as strong and independent, someone who made others feel welcomed and at ease. Her tragic end felt cruel and unthinkably senseless. "We don't understand why," sobbed her younger sister in a televised plea to the public. "Please, if anyone knows something, if you saw anything, tell the police. We just want this monster caught." The investigation deepens. The similarities between Maria and Brenda's cases forced law enforcement to admit they had a serial killer on their hands. FBI agents were brought in to assist. Profiler Jack Morrison described the killer as methodical, highly intelligent, and deeply disturbed. This is someone who plans carefully, who strikes with precision, and who sees these women as objects for his twisted needs. He's confident, and he's not done. But even with the FBI's help, leads were scarce. Security footage from nearby shops had failed to capture any clear images of the suspect. Maria's co-workers described the night as uneventful, with no suspicious characters hanging around the cafe. Lip prints were found on the thermos, but DNA technology wasn't yet advanced enough to reveal much about the killer. The rising panic, Edgefield's quiet dread turns to chaos. By the end of January, the chilling events in Edgefield had turned the small town's simmering anxiety into outright terror. With Brenda Anderson's brutal murder still fresh in everyone's minds, the discovery of Maria Gonzalez's lifeless body only cemented one terrifying truth. There was a serial killer in their midst, and he wasn't done. The once cozy and uneventful streets of Edgefield quickly transformed into a landscape of fear. It wasn't just the murders themselves that terrified people, it was the randomness. Brenda and Maria were respected women, fixtures of the tight-knit community. Neither had enemies or lived lives that invited danger. If they could be targeted, who was next? Parents in the town became hyper-protective overnight. Children who normally walked to school or played outside until dinner were now closely guarded. "We've canceled playdates," one mother told a local TV crew as she loaded her children into her minivan. "I don't care if it seems paranoid. Until this maniac is caught, my kids are staying in my sight." Local grocery stores and diners, once bustling meeting spots for townsfolk, saw plummeting foot traffic. Women stopped going out alone altogether. Husbands adjusted their work schedules to escort their wives and daughters wherever they needed to go. Coffee shops installed extra locks, and convenience stores invested in motion-sensitive floodlights. Even still, the town began to feel like a ghost of what it had once been. Curfews and suspicion. By mid-February, public fear had turned to widespread paranoia. Voluntary curfews settled over the town like a shadow. Edgefield streets, once lively even into the later hours, fell silent after 8 p.m., reminiscent of a curfew under martial law. Jessica Miller, a 16-year-old cashier at a local gas station, described the unease she felt working night shifts. After 7 p.m., no one came in. The whole store felt hollow. I kept staring out at the parking lot just waiting to see something, or someone. Her manager eventually began locking the doors after sundown and only served customers through the window hatch. Meanwhile, the rumor mill spun wildly. Whispers filled the church pews on Sunday mornings and dominated whispered conversations at every town council meeting. Theories about the killer proliferated, some of them absurd, others hauntingly plausible. One group of neighbors became convinced that the killer was living among them, hiding in plain sight. After all, who else could know the town well enough to target these women so subtly, so effectively, without being seen? Some residents fixated on a particular suspicion. The killer must be from the area, maybe even someone recognizable. "It has to be someone we know," said Earl Peterson, a retired mechanic whose home overlooked Miller's Market. "You can't pull something off like this and just vanish without knowing Edgefield like the back of your hand. Whoever he is, he's familiar, and that makes it scarier." Men who fit certain vague criteria, single men who kept to themselves or strangers recently moved into town, faced sidelong glances or outright accusations. Tim Watkins, a loner who worked third shift at the steel plant, found himself at the center of ugly speculation. After someone anonymously called the sheriff's office suggesting he sounded like the type of guy who'd do it, Watkins found himself questioned aggressively by local law enforcement. Weeks later, his name was quietly cleared, but it was too late. The damage to his reputation lingered. With every failure to zero in on a suspect, trust within the close-knit town began to fray. Media frenzy. As news of Edgefield's nightmare spread beyond Ohio, journalists descended upon the town in droves. Local television stations ran nightly updates, heightening the growing unease by alluding to what insiders had whispered for weeks. This killer wasn't just murdering, he was mutilating. Larger network reporters picked up these breadcrumbs and sensationalized them, splashing headlines like "The Thermos Killer Stalks Small Ohio Town Across Primetime Slots." Reporters parked their vans at crime scenes, blocking neighborhood streets with towering antennas and satellite dishes. Microphones filled every town hall meeting, asking pointed questions about whether the police were doing enough. Chief Raymond Holden, already grappling with his department's lack of experience in handling homicides, found himself backed into humiliating press conferences. "We are doing everything we can," Holden said to a room packed with reporters. "This individual has proven capable of evading detection, but I can assure you that we are working with the FBI and other resources to track this killer down." His words rang hollow against the backdrop of fear gripping the community. The intense scrutiny applied by the media had two distinct effects. It put more pressure on law enforcement to produce results, and it unleashed a wave of amateur sleuths and hotline calls. Anonymous tips rolled in by the dozens, each one adding noise but rarely clarity to the investigation. "I saw someone acting strange outside Miller's Market last week," one caller said. Another insisted the killer was an out-of-towner, describing a suspicious man seen loitering around gas stations late at night. "He had to be watching them, staking out his victims," they said. But every tip only deepened the confusion, scattering the investigators' efforts even further. The businesses close. Early local businesses bore the brunt of Edgefield's descent into chaos. Miller's Market, the site of Brenda's murder, slashed its operating hours. Once open until 10 p.m., the store now shuttered at 7 p.m. sharp. Patty's Diner, a town staple famous for its 24-hour breakfast, trimmed their hours to daytime shifts only as fewer and fewer diners felt comfortable coming out after dark. The streets surrounding Main Street became quieter than ever, a silence that felt unnatural and heavy. "I don't know how long we can keep this going," said Patty Michaels, the diner's owner and a lifelong Edgefield resident. "After Brenda and Maria, people just don't want to be out late. I don't blame them, but this town, it was never like this. We were safe before, we ain't safe no more." Edgefield copes with the fear. For many, the worst part wasn't just the fear of becoming the killer's next target, it was the not knowing. Who was he? Why was he doing this? And how was he picking his victims? With no leads and no motive apparent, the town's anxiety hardened into a collective paranoia. A group of local women formed a safety coalition, organizing carpools and escorts for anyone who worked night shifts or felt unsafe walking alone. Flyers were posted around town, warning women to walk in pairs and detailing ways to avoid being targeted. Home security systems and motion-activated lights became the must-have items of the season. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts within days. As fear grew, so did the stories. Parents told their kids to stay away from the woods, in part to protect them, in part to silence their own nagging fears. "He could be anywhere," one father muttered to his wife as their family sat through dinner in the dim light of their shuttered home. What better place than the woods to keep out of sight? The uncertainty takes its toll. By mid-February, Edgefield was no longer the town it had been in December 1996. It had become a place consumed by fear, suspicion, and restraint. A town where the streets emptied at dusk and no walk home felt safe. Quiet nights were no longer a comfort. They were a chilling reminder that somewhere, in the shadows, the killer lay in wait. And perhaps most terrifying, everyone began to realize two immutable truths. Edgefield's predator wasn't done, and no one was prepared for what would come next. The killer's savage methods. What struck investigators first was the precision, the chilling, almost surgical precision. This wasn't just random violence or a crime of passion, this was control. Cruel, deliberate control. With Brenda Anderson and Maria Gonzalez as the killer's first known victims, a clear but disturbing pattern began to emerge, setting the Thermos killer apart from any typical criminal. Each victim seemed to have been carefully selected, though for reasons neither the police nor the FBI profilers could yet discern. Young women, working late hours or walking home alone, often in dimly lit and isolated areas. The killer moved like a phantom, attacking in places with virtually no security cameras, no prying witnesses, and just enough cover to vanish into the night. The moment of attack. From the evidence at the crime scenes, experts deduced the killer's method of operation. He wasn't someone who acted impulsively. Each attack was calculated, almost like a predator stalking prey. The women were caught off guard. They didn't see him coming until it was too late. Footprints left at both the supermarket parking lot and the alley near the cafe suggested that the killer approached quietly, wearing heavily insulated boots that wouldn't crunch loudly in the snow. He employed surprise as his deadliest weapon, likely striking his victims from behind, either with a blunt object or his bare hands. The victims, investigators believed, were overpowered quickly. Brenda's autopsy revealed she had been struck hard but cleanly, an efficient blow to the base of the skull that knocked her unconscious. Maria's injuries told a similar story. There were no drawn-out struggles, no excessive mess at the initial scene of the crime. This wasn't someone who enjoyed the hunt, it was the aftermath, the control, that mattered to him. The killer was unnervingly efficient in how he subdued his victims, but what followed was far more horrifying. The ritualistic signature. The first time Detective Lisa Howard unscrewed the lid of the metal thermos found next to Brenda Anderson's body, she realized this was no ordinary murder. The contents inside, the small, mutilated fragment of human tissue, sent shockwaves through everyone working on the case. Mutilation wasn't uncommon in serial killings, but the delivery of this grotesque trophy in a thermos was something investigators had never encountered before. When Maria Gonzalez was found, another stainless steel thermos was discovered beside her body. Again, it contained human remains, carefully selected and placed. The objects felt more than just trophies from the crime. To the FBI's behavioral analysts, they represented a chilling level of psychological intent. "Why the thermos?" FBI profiler Jack Morrison asked aloud during a late-night meeting with the department's overwhelmed officers. "This isn't random. He's leaving us these objects for a reason. He wants us to know what he's done, to appreciate his work." The thermos itself became the killer's signature, as chilling and intentional as a handwritten calling card. Polished spotless, always with the lid screwed on tightly, the stainless steel objects were unnervingly out of place against the brutality of the crime scenes. It was this contrast that made an already horrific act even more sinister, as if the thermos symbolized order in the aftermath of chaos, psyche of a predator. The FBI profilers working the case began to flesh out a profile of the killer's psychology, combing through crime scene details for insight into his mind. This wasn't just about killing. For the thermos killer, the violence served a deeper, more twisted purpose. "This type of mutilation indicates obsession," profiler Morrison explained in a briefing. "He doesn't see his victims as people. To him they're canvases, objects he can manipulate, control, and violate in ways that satisfy his inner compulsions. He's feeding some deeply warped psychological need, likely rooted in rejection or dehumanization in his own life." The level of care shown in handling the thermoses was also a chilling clue. The stainless steel containers weren't objects meant to be discarded. They were purposefully chosen, methodically cleaned, and left in pristine condition. Why? Investigators believed it symbolized control. A man capable of leaving behind such calculated gifts wasn't just trying to spread fear, he was demonstrating his dominance. He wanted to mock the police, to show them they couldn't catch him. Adding to the terror was the fact that the killer showed restraint. Unlike some serial predators, his violence wasn't frenzied or unhinged. Each mutilation appeared to be done with precision, suggesting technical knowledge or prior experience with anatomy. Was he a butcher, a former medical professional, or simply someone who had studied these techniques obsessively? The thermos held horrifying secrets, and each discovery brought them no closer to understanding who or why. Victimology and patterns. One of the most frustrating aspects for law enforcement was the lack of a clear connection between the victims beyond their profiles. Brenda Anderson was a kindergarten teacher, while Maria Gonzalez managed a coffee shop. Neither had any enemies, conflicts in their lives, or risky behaviors that might have painted them as potential targets for violence. They were simply two ordinary women living quiet, respectable lives. This randomness made the crimes even more chilling. If Brenda and Maria could be victims, then anyone could. And while the killer clearly had a preference for targeting women, the rules weren't absolute. Jason Parker, the third confirmed victim, a middle-aged male taxi driver, proved that. Though his murder bore fewer signs of the savage mutilation seen in Brenda and Maria's cases, the presence of the thermos next to his body confirmed it was the same hand behind all the killings. Feeding the fear. What began as isolated tragedies evolved into a community-wide nightmare as details of the killer's methods became public knowledge. The thermos in particular became the subject of morbid fascination and dread. Small stainless steel containers that once sat innocently on countertops now felt like harbingers of death. People whispered about the thermoses left at the crime scenes, the mutilation they held inside. The idea of a killer who not only savaged his victims but then calmly presented pieces of them as souvenirs was more horrifying than most could comprehend. The thermos killer had successfully plunged Edgefield into chaos. His savage methods became the stuff of nightmares, whispered in hushed circles at the church, in line at the grocery store, or over the phone late at night. Women bought self-defense kits, tasers, and mace en masse. Local news media warned residents to be vigilant, but the advice did little to ease the prevailing sense of dread. After all, this wasn't a killer you could predict. His methods weren't impulsive. His motives weren't obvious. He didn't need a reason to strike, just an opportunity. What frightened the people of Edgefield most wasn't just the killer's violence or his careful planning. It was the message behind his actions. By leaving the thermos, by ensuring it was found, he was saying, "I'm in control, this is my game." And perhaps the clearest part of that message was also the most horrifying. He wasn't finished yet. A peculiar case emerges. A male victim breaks the pattern. February in Edgefield was a grim season of suspicion and fear. By now, 2 gruesome murders had etched permanent scars into the fabric of the once placid Ohio town. Brenda Anderson and Maria Gonzalez had been the first victims, 2 young women whose lives were cut short in brutal, seemingly ritualistic fashion. The thermos killer, as residents had begun to call the unknown predator, was established as someone who targeted women who were alone, vulnerable, and unsuspecting. But everything the police thought they understood about the killer's methods was shattered on the night of February 21, 1997, when a third body was discovered. This time, it wasn't a woman. Jason Parker, a 40-year-old taxi driver, was found dead in the industrial area on the outskirts of town, an uninspiring stretch filled with abandoned warehouses and rusting equipment. What struck detectives most was not just the departure from the killer's apparent pattern of targeting women, but the manner of this victim's death, a break from the ritual. Jason was a local, someone who was known to many in the community, even if not particularly well-liked or disliked. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a smoker's cough, he had lived a relatively low-profile life. His job required him to work long hours at odd times, and although he wasn't someone that came across as outgoing, he earned a reputation for showing up when you needed a ride in the dead of winter or during short breaks between storms, not an uncommon occurrence in Ohio. At 1:25 a.m., a passerby walking their dog noticed what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle parked near an old steel factory that had been closing operations for years. The engine of the taxi was still running, its yellow cab light flickering dimly. The dog's barking led the witness to peek inside the vehicle, only to recoil in horror at what they saw through the frosted windshield. Jason Parker's lifeless body slumped forward over the steering wheel. Within an hour, crime scene investigators confirmed what many already suspected. This was no accidental death. Jason Parker had been murdered, and it came with the all-too-familiar calling card of the thermos killer. The crime scene detectives knew immediately they were dealing with the same individual. Jason was not simply dead, his murder carried specific macabre trademarks. Though there were no signs of the elaborate mutilations seen in Brenda and Maria's cases, the thermos was unmistakable. Sitting upright in Jason's cab, wedged between the front seats, was yet another stainless steel thermos, polished and pristine. "Same damn thermos," muttered Detective Lisa Howard as she approached the scene, gloves already pulled on. The dread in her voice betrayed her professional facade. She retrieved the container cautiously, glancing at her partner. "Whatever's in here, it's not going to make sense." The medical examiner found Jason's death to be less barbaric than the prior murders, at least on the surface. There was no evidence of elaborate mutilation or organ extraction, no gruesome ritualistic horror scarring the body. Instead, Jason's throat had been cut with what appeared to be surgical precision, one clean slice deep enough to silence him instantly. Opening the thermos, investigators weren't greeted with the terrible fragments of human flesh that characterized past instances. Instead, they discovered something equally disturbing in its simplicity. Jason's cab license, torn neatly into quarters and placed carefully inside the container. "What the hell does this mean?" Officer Terry King growled, pacing near the crime scene tape. "This guy's losing his mind or what?" To this question, the profiling team had no definitive answers. What was clear was this: the thermos killer had moved outside his usual boundaries. He didn't just break his pattern of killing women, the level of brutality had shifted as well. The cold, clinical approach to Jason Parker's murder offered stark contrast to the grotesque violence inflicted upon Brenda and Maria. But why? Dissecting the motive. Though the departure from the killer's established MO mystified investigators, it also left them with critical new questions. Why would someone so deliberate, so obsessed with ritual, break from the behavioral rigidity that had defined their crimes? Theories began to surface almost immediately. Some profilers believed Jason may have witnessed something connected to Brenda or Maria's murders, marking him as a liability to the killer's plans. Others speculated that the killer's choice of Jason was an intentional assertion, a chilling way of stating, "I can change the rules whenever I want." "This isn't about losing control," said FBI profiler Jack Morrison in a closed law enforcement meeting days after Jason's murder. "This is about showing control. Every one of his choices screams dominance. This man wanted us to know he's capable of stepping outside the box we thought we put him in. To him there are no patterns. He's calling the shots and we're just trying to keep up." The town's reaction. If Brenda Anderson's death had shocked Edgefield and Maria Gonzalez's murder had deepened the town's collective fear, then Jason Parker's killing triggered outright chaos. His death expanded the pool of potential victims exponentially. "Before we could at least say it was women," choked Ellie Reyes, a local barista who had organized carpools for women working night shifts. "But now it's anybody. Everyone feels like the next target." The idea of Jason, a working-class man with no apparent connection to the first two women, being murdered shook the basic assumptions people clung to for comfort. Edgefield residents had assured themselves that avoiding certain behaviors, avoiding being alone or traveling in groups, would shield them from harm. But Jason hadn't been a young woman walking home alone. He'd been a man behind the locked doors of his cab in his own space working his usual shift. Whatever thin sense of security the town had held onto was obliterated. "That's what makes this guy so dangerous," Sheriff Raymond Holden said in a public address just days after the third murder. "He doesn't follow a playbook. He wants us guessing. He's making us paranoid, and that's exactly what he wants." Families began taking drastic measures. Men who thought they were safe traveling solo at night suddenly questioned their own safety. Taxi drivers left the business altogether, unwilling to take chances. Businesses already closing early began cutting hours even further. Soon, Edgefield after dark became a ghost town, its streets empty except for the occasional patrol car scanning blank storefronts with its searchlight. Unanswered questions. The killing of Jason Parker didn't just expand the scope of fear, it added new layers of confusion to a case already mired in mystery. Why had Jason been spared the mutilation that defined the earlier murders? And why had his taxi license been placed inside the thermos rather than pieces of his body? "This guy is trying to tell us something," Morrison theorized late one night to his team as the FBI pored over crime photos. "The problem is, we're not speaking his language. Every thermos, every kill, they're messages, but what the hell is he saying? And do we have enough time to figure it out before he's gone again?" Despite their determination, answers remained elusive. And what haunted investigators most was the gnawing realization that Jason Parker's brutal death wasn't the escalation they feared. It was just another step in a game they hadn't begun to understand. The investigation stalls, trapped in a maze of dead ends. As the months rolled on in 1997, what had once been a desperate and energetic drive to capture the thermos killer began to spiral into frustration and exhaustion. Despite an increasing police presence and the support of FBI profilers, the case was slipping through the cracks, leaving law enforcement and the community in Edgefield desperate for answers. Each new clue seemed promising at first, only to fade into another frustrating dead end. The murders of Brenda Anderson, Maria Gonzalez, and Jason Parker had painted a terrifying portrait of a killer who thrived on control, precision, and unpredictability. But almost everything gathered by investigators, every autopsy report, every witness statement, every scrap of forensic evidence led to more questions than answers. Theories without proof. For local investigators, the partnership with FBI behavioral specialists had been a double-edged sword. On one hand, the profilers provided vital insight into the psychological makeup of the killer, describing him as a deeply disturbed individual compelled by a profound need to dominate and manipulate his victims. On the other hand, none of that insight brought them closer to identifying him. "I don't care about his psychological profile," Chief Raymond Holden vented during one tense strategy meeting, running a tired hand across his desk. "I don't want to know what he's thinking, I want to know who the hell he is." But that wasn't happening, not with the evidence they had so far. The police DNA samples collected from the thermoses helped confirm that all three murders were committed by the same person, but that DNA didn't match any records in the police database. Fingerprints? None. It appeared the killer was meticulous, wearing gloves and removing all traceable evidence before leaving his crime scenes. Forensic studies also struggled to provide many leads from the thermoses themselves. Each stainless steel thermos was commercially available and widely sold, which made tracing the purchases nearly impossible. The thermoses were cleaned and polished to perfection, erasing any usage evidence. Profiler Jack Morrison grimly explained at one point, "This isn't a kid who's sloppy or haphazard, he's deliberate. That's why he's still out there. The planning that goes into each attack is bordering on obsessive. He's mocking us. Every thermos is like a message. You think you'll catch me? Think again." Witnesses come forward but bring confusion. By early spring, the community turned to frantic speculation, which led to a surge of calls and reports to the police tip line. Sightings of suspicious men became almost a daily occurrence, but most were fleeting, exaggerated, or entirely baseless. Of all the witnesses who claimed they might have seen something connected to the killings, none could definitively describe anyone who matched a pattern. One especially frustrating lead came from a grocery store clerk who insisted they'd seen a man acting suspiciously in Brenda Anderson's parking lot the day she was killed. He was tall, maybe 6'2", white guy, brown hair, wearing a coat and gloves. He was just hovering out there near the grocery carts, the clerk recalled. It sounded solid until investigators reviewed pre-existing security camera footage of the parking lot, only to find no such individual anywhere near Brenda at any time before her attack. Another dead end. "Everyone starts seeing ghosts when they're scared," Officer Terry King remarked after yet another testimony led nowhere. "Doesn't mean it helps us." As Edgefield spiraled deeper into paranoia, the small-town gossip network only added to the growing chaos. Speculation circulated about outsiders in town, feeding the belief that the killer was a stranger, not one of their own. Others grew suspicious of men who were local but reclusive, mechanics, truck drivers, and factory workers, spotlighting anyone whose schedule or demeanor felt off. None of these suspicions were grounded in evidence, yet fear drove people to accuse neighbors under the thinnest of pretexts: pressure on the police. While Edgefield law enforcement wrestled with the community's growing panic, the investigation team itself began to strain under the weight of the case. Resources were stretched thin. Officers who had spent their careers handling routine thefts or traffic violations now found themselves working overtime on a case many admitted they weren't equipped to solve. Chief Holden, serving as the public face of the investigation, became the lightning rod for local outrage. Parents demanded answers, business owners begged for safety. One contentious town hall meeting devolved into a shouting match as residents accused the police of incompetence. "What are we paying you people for if you can't stop this maniac?" shouted one furious resident. Others followed with calls for the FBI team to take over entirely. Holden's exhaustion was visible in his every public appearance. At one press conference, when asked whether the police were any closer to arresting the thermos killer, he gave an uncharacteristically candid response. "We're doing everything we can with what we've got," he said slowly, his words laced with defeat. "Sometimes these cases take time, we can't just magically find him. He's making it very hard for us to track him down." The remark, broadcasted across state TV stations, became an emblem of the town's worsening confidence in its leaders. A changing focus. Recognizing the investigation's stagnation, the FBI upped its involvement, with profiler Jack Morrison taking a more prominent role in shaping the next steps. Morrison, known for his no-nonsense approach, insisted they needed to start thinking beyond the murders themselves. "This guy isn't going to randomly stop," Morrison warned his colleagues during an April meeting. "We need to stop waiting for him to escalate and start questioning why he's choosing his victims. The answers are in the pattern, and believe me, there is one. We just haven't found it yet." The team began poring over every personal detail about Brenda, Maria, and Jason. Where they lived, where they worked, their routines, their interactions. But there were no clear connections beyond geography. The victims didn't appear to know one another, or frequent the same spots. Everything about the murders seemed random except for the thermos, which tied them all together. "No connections, no motive," Holden murmured at one particularly disheartening strategy meeting. "He's just killing. How the hell are we supposed to stop someone when we don't even know what he wants?" A town on edge. The prolonged silence, both from the killer and from the investigators, kept Edgefield teetering on the edge of uncertainty well into the spring. By now, curfews were no longer voluntary. Most families didn't leave their homes after sunset without good reason. Businesses tightened security or shut down entirely. More than ever, the absence of a breakthrough gnawed at the investigators. "This guy's not invisible," Chief Holden muttered to himself late one night in his office, the walls around him covered in a sprawling web of charts, maps, and timelines of the crimes. "We just haven't been looking at him the right way." What began as a desperate chase had devolved into a murky maze of frustration and unending dead ends, and yet, every investigator knew one grim truth. The killer wasn't done. They weren't waiting for him to make a mistake, he was waiting for them. The fragile psyche of the killer. By the summer of 1997, after months of terror gripping Edgefield, investigators knew for certain that whoever the Thermos killer was, he wasn't driven by purely external motives like greed or revenge. Instead, his actions pointed to a complex, fractured inner world, a psyche teetering on the edge of instability, filled with darkness, control, and obsession. For the FBI's profiling unit, the Thermos killer was a dream subject. Profiler Jack Morrison would later describe him in his case notes as the definition of methodical madness, a man simultaneously in chaos and control, wielding his brutality like a scalpel. But for Edgefield residents, understanding the killer's psyche wasn't comforting, it was horrifying. It meant he wasn't just a criminal who could be reasoned with, or a man who lashed out in temporary rage. He was something worse, a predator who killed to fulfill a deep-rooted psychological need, a calculated mind driven by chaos. From the very beginning, law enforcement had marveled, and been chilled by, the meticulous nature of the Thermos killer's crimes. His ability to leave behind practically no forensic evidence suggested not just intelligence, but meticulous planning. He moved undetected, evading local officers and baffling state and federal investigators. "This isn't someone acting on a random whim," Morrison told a frustrated group of Edgefield officers during one heated briefing. "Everything, the victims, the thermoses, the mutilations, it's all deliberate, it's all part of a ritual. You're looking at a man who thrives on control. He doesn't just want to kill, he wants to orchestrate everything about it." The profilers had little doubt this need for control had deep psychological roots. The Thermos killer wasn't creating chaos, he was creating order. The thermos, always polished to a shine and placed ceremoniously near the victims' bodies, wasn't just some random signature. To the killer it represented perfection. Where his victims, the humans he regarded as imperfect or flawed, were brutalized and torn apart, the thermos stood in stark contrast, untouched, clean, and pristine. "It's like he's trying to impose a twisted form of balance on his crimes," Morrison added. "The thermos is an extension of himself, controlled, polished, and perfect. It reflects exactly what he wants us to see, his power over life and death." Origins of a predator. While investigators had no name or face to attach to the killer, their profiling work gradually began to paint a chilling picture of who he might be and why he killed. Most of the clues came from analyzing the disturbing way he mutilated his victims. Forensic psychologists were almost unanimous in their belief. This wasn't just about killing, it was about power. The Thermos killer wasn't compelled by a simple desire to take lives, he was attempting to reclaim control over something he felt had been stolen from him. The mutilations were precise and surgical, suggesting either an anatomical background or an obsessive level of self-education. "In his mind he isn't just killing his victims," Morrison explained during an internal briefing with local officials. "He's transforming them. They aren't people to him, they're objects, broken pieces that he can fix in the only way he knows how. But fixing them means destroying them. This level of contamination isn't just derangement, it's deeply personal." Profiler Morrison theorized that the killer likely experienced some form of dehumanization in his own life, years of being objectified, ignored, or dismissed. Whether it was rooted in bullying, rejection, or neglect, this profound sense of being invisible could explain the killer's need to dominate others in such grotesque and deliberate ways. "He's reclaiming control," Morrison said. "Every cut he makes, every organ he removes, it's him shouting at the world, 'I'm in charge now.' But he's also leaving the thermos behind as a taunt, a way of saying, 'You'll never fix me.'" The need for ritual. While most serial killers leave behind some semblance of a pattern, the Thermos killer's crimes were remarkable for the eerily ritualistic elements they involved, and none more prominent than the stainless steel thermos. The thermos wasn't just a trophy, like many killers leave behind, it was more than that. Its placement at each scene, neatly and deliberately, spoke to the killer's larger intent. Every crime carried the same eerie steps. He incapacitated his victims with precision, mutilated them with surgical accuracy, and left the thermos as the final mark, like a twisted exclamation point on his horrific sentence. FBI analysts compared the thermos to a ceremonial object, something sacred in the killer's warped world. "The thermos is everything," Morrison explained. "It's his signature, sure, but it's more than that. It's the one thing in his life he can control completely. It's polished to perfection, its contents arranged carefully. To him, the thermos is order. It's clean and perfect in a way his victims can never be." In some ways this made the killer even harder to catch. His crimes weren't spontaneous or driven by passion. They were calculated rituals, rehearsed down to the smallest detail. Investigators speculated he likely spent weeks stalking each victim, observing their routines, and planning the perfect moment to strike, snapping under the surface. Despite his outward planning and composure, the killer's actions also betrayed another truth. Underneath his calm, calculated veneer was a man barely holding himself together. Every ritual he carried out, every thermos he left behind, every mutilation he performed, they were all evidence of a growing obsession that he could no longer control. "This guy's unraveling," Morrison warned detectives as the summer dragged on without a breakthrough. "The longer he goes without being caught, the more risks he's willing to take. The thermos may be perfect, but his psyche isn't. He's leaving us clues, and eventually, he's going to slip up." This unraveling wouldn't happen all at once. As Morrison explained, killers like the thermos killer didn't just break suddenly. Their desire for control kept them afloat, even as their compulsions grew stronger and harder to contain. It was a terrifying balancing act, and the moment the killer's need for control clashed with his unraveling mind, it would almost certainly lead to an escalation. "That's the thing about these predators," Morrison said grimly. "They don't stop. Not until we catch them, or they reach a point where the killings don't satisfy them anymore, and they step up their game in ways we can't even imagine." A town caught in his shadow. For Edgefield, the thought of their tormentor as a man both controlled and utterly out of control was almost too much to bear. The profiler's insights served to confirm what many already feared. This wasn't a killer they could anticipate. He didn't follow rules or patterns anyone in the town could recognize. If anything, his unpredictability was the most terrifying aspect of all. "He's not like us," Maria Gonzalez's boss was heard saying at a local memorial service. "I don't care what the experts say, I don't think he's broken inside. He's hollow. There's nothing human left in him." This sentiment echoed throughout the community as the months dragged on. Fear of a man who could be anywhere, waiting silently in the shadows, striking when no one expected it. But for Morrison and the FBI, the killer wasn't a void to be feared. He was something worse. A man who masked his fragility with perfection and control, who turned his pain outward on others in the most horrifying way. And the most chilling thought of all was this: he wasn't finished. The fourth murder shocks the town. By August 1997, Edgefield, Ohio had grown weary from months of relentless fear. The shadow of the thermos killer hung over the community like an unshakable storm cloud. 3 murders, each more horrifying than the last, had revealed a killer obsessed with control and precision. A predator who seemed to strike without rhyme or reason. Yet even in their fragile state, the people of Edgefield clung to one thread of hope, the small, fleeting belief that the chaos was finally subsiding. That hope was shattered on the evening of August 14th, when the killer struck again. This time the victim was Julie McNamara, a 26-year-old bank teller known for her cheery disposition and impeccable professionalism. Julie wasn't just a fixture in the town's financial world. She was a beloved figure in the community, a helpful, smiling face everyone trusted. The fourth murder didn't just mark another ghastly crime for Edgefield, it utterly obliterated any lingering illusion of safety. When Julie's body was discovered, the killer's growing boldness became impossible to ignore. He wasn't just hunting anymore, he was taunting them. A murder close to home. Unlike the previous murders, which had occurred in darker, more secluded parts of town, Julie's murder unfolded frighteningly close to a densely populated residential area. Her body was discovered near her apartment complex, barely 300 yards from where children often played in a local park, and neighbors walked their dogs during twilight. It was clear now, no area, no level of public visibility, could deter him. Julie's co-workers at the First State Bank reported that she had stayed late that Thursday evening to finish preparing loan paperwork for a local farming family. She often went above and beyond for customers, and it wasn't unusual for her to stay after banking hours to ensure every detail was taken care of. After leaving work at approximately 7:30 p.m., Julie was seen carrying her satchel and coffee tumbler, the same reusable one she always brought to work, while heading toward her white Volkswagen parked just a block down the street. Several witnesses recalled seeing her walking briskly but cheerfully, perhaps eager to get home after a long day. However, somewhere along that short, routine walk, Julie was intercepted. By the time she reached the parking lot gate of her apartment complex, she had vanished into the night. The discovery. It wasn't until the next morning that Julie's body was found. A paperboy delivering newspapers on his early route made the grim discovery after cutting through the apartment complex's rear courtyard to save time. As his bicycle wheel bumped over pavers slick with dew, something strange caught his eye. The shape of a person sprawled awkwardly against the side of a maintenance shed. At first, the boy didn't believe what he was seeing. He thought it might be a drunk who had passed out in the yard, but as he got closer, the horror of the scene became undeniable. Julie's lifeless body lay collapsed beneath the graying wooden structure. Her satchel was tossed to one side. The coffee tumbler she always carried was missing, replaced as expected by something far darker. Another stainless steel thermos. The boy screamed loud enough to wake nearby residents, and within minutes police sirens filled the early morning air. The crime scene grows bolder. Julie's murder scene bore the hallmarks of the thermos killer, yet something about its staging felt strikingly different. Forensic investigators determined that Julie had likely been killed there, at the spot where she was found, rather than being moved post-mortem like some previous victims. This act of choosing such a public, highly visible location shocked police. Chief Raymond Holden muttered gruffly into his radio, "He's getting riskier, either he's taunting us or he's slipping." Julie's injuries also echoed the surgical precision the killer had shown before. A single blow near the back of her skull rendered her unconscious, followed by acts of sickening mutilation that only deepened the psychological impact. However, there was something distinctly chilling about the thermos this time. Inside it, investigators discovered a strand of hair that didn't belong to Julie. It was the first time the killer had left a piece of physical evidence that suggested someone other than the victim. The strand of hair was thick, dark, and slightly coarse, consistent with that of a man, though its origins were initially unclear. "This has to mean something," whispered Detective Lisa Howard, standing stiffly near the crime scene as the thermos was methodically bagged for analysis. "He's leaving us breadcrumbs, but why? Is he mocking us or is he starting to slip?" Profiler Jack Morrison, who had been continually piecing together the killer's psychology, believed it was no accident. "This isn't a mistake," he said during the initial debriefing after Julie's murder. "This man doesn't make mistakes. If he's leaving something different behind, it's because he wants us to find it. This hair is a message." The town is sent reeling. Julie's murder destabilized Edgefield in ways the previous killings hadn't. It wasn't just the fact that it had taken place so close to a residential area, or that Julie had been a respected and well-loved community member. It was the audacity of the crime. The thermos killer had brought his violence out of the shadows and into the very heart of Edgefield's neighborhoods. Before we could tell ourselves, it only happens in dark alleys or parking lots, local pastor Ben Everett remarked during a subsequent prayer service for Julie. Now he's shown us there's no line he won't cross, there's no limit to his cruelty. Parents clutched their children tighter. The streets around Julie's apartment were deserted by dusk. Windows were locked, lights left glaring deep into the night. Even at midday, the complex's residents moved nervously, gazing over their shoulders as if the killer might still be lurking in the bushes. Residents who had previously held out hope that Edgefield would reclaim its safety were now consumed by despair. "He can get anyone," said Donna Preston, a widow who lived one building over from Julie's. "If he could kill her, right there in plain sight, what's stopping him from coming after any of us? I don't think we'll ever be safe again." The investigation takes a turn. The strand of hair found inside the thermos ignited fresh urgency among both Edgefield law enforcement and the FBI. It was too specific, too deliberate, not to mean something. Forensics quickly determined that the hair did not belong to any of the victims killed thus far. It wasn't a random piece of debris either. Its presence, packaged so deliberately in the thermos, had to be part of the killer's message, a taunting new layer in his game. Chief Holden wasn't optimistic. "Even if this hair gives us a DNA lead, what are the chances it matches anyone in the system?" he asked Morrison. "We've been chasing a ghost, and so far the system hasn't helped us out of the dark." But Morrison saw things differently. "This is him bending the dynamic," the profiler explained. "The hair is a breadcrumb, sure, but it's also something else. He's trying to redirect us. Either there's another story he's trying to tell, or this hair will factor into his escalation. Whatever it is, it's deliberate. He's still calling the shots." A community in free fall. Julie's death was a breaking point for many in Edgefield. Businesses that had barely held on after the previous murders began shuttering for good. Families that could afford to leave packed up and moved north or west to escape the killer's tightening grip on the town's psyche. Those who stayed felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear, speculation, and doubt. "This isn't home anymore," said Arthur McKinney, Julie's neighbor, while boarding over the basement windows of his home. "It's a hunting ground. We're just waiting to see who he picks off next." For law enforcement, the killer's taunt, his polished thermos with the strand of hair, pushed the hunt into frantic overdrive. But beneath their resolve, a clear truth was beginning to take hold. The thermos killer wasn't finished. Julie's murder was not an ending. It was a shift, a message crafted in blood and patience. No one in Edgefield knew it at the time, but the discovery of that strange strand of hair would be the key to unraveling the case. It just wouldn't happen soon enough to prevent the darkness yet to come. Narrowing down the suspect, a mysterious man. By September 1997, the relentless hunt for the thermos killer reached a critical turning point, though no one in the Edgefield Police Department dared to call it progress just yet. The trail had gone cold on multiple occasions, with forensic evidence leading nowhere, public tips veering off into countless dead ends, and the killer's erratic selection of victims defying typical profiling patterns. But then, like a long-hidden thread accidentally snagged, a small, seemingly inconsequential piece of information started to pull everything together. The break came from an often used but unreliable source, a witness. It wasn't the detailed kind of account detectives hope for, but rather a fragmented memory, blurry, incomplete, and splashed with the usual paranoia present in a community on edge. Yet, among hundreds of other tips, it was this one that would eventually guide investigators closer to the shadowy figure they had been chasing. The initial lead. It began when a woman named Patricia Dunn came forward, reluctantly at first, during one of the increasingly tense town council meetings. Patricia, a retired nurse who lived near Julie McNamara's apartment complex, nervously recounted something she had seen several weeks earlier that she believed might be connected. "I'm not saying I know anything," Patricia stammered, fidgeting with her scarf as half the room stared at her. "But there was this guy, I've seen him before, I think, near Julie's building. He was just standing there, watching, like he didn't belong." Detectives Howard and King, who attended the meeting to field questions from the growingly irate community, pressed for details, though Patricia's recollection was frustratingly vague. She described a man in his 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing what she only remembered as a dark cap, like those baseball ones, and a jacket. Nothing fancy. Patricia added, "He didn't say anything, but the way he was just standing, it wasn't normal. He didn't seem like he lived here. I was going to call someone, but I don't know. He left before I could say much else." At first the description wasn't groundbreaking. How many men in Edgefield wore baseball caps and jackets during the colder months? Dozens, if not hundreds. But when Patricia mentioned that she thought she had also seen the same man near the bank where Julie worked several days earlier, it piqued Detective Lisa Howard's interest. "You're saying you saw him twice, once at Julie's apartment and once at her workplace?" Howard clarified, leaning forward on the folding chair someone had dragged in for the detectives. Patricia hesitated before nodding. "I think so. I mean, yeah, I think it was him. Why else would someone random just be standing around? It felt off." Patterns begin to emerge. Howard and King knew the description by itself wasn't enough to act on, but Patricia's account wasn't the only report of a suspicious figure near Julie's residence. Over the weeks following the murder, 2 other neighbors had claimed to see an unfamiliar man loitering by her building's parking lot in the days before she was killed. While their descriptions of the man's appearance were light on details, all mentioned him wearing a dark cap and leaning against a nearby lamppost or wall, as if waiting for something, or someone. When Detective King cross-referenced these sightings with an earlier stack of reports from Brenda Anderson's neighborhood, a startling similarity emerged. 2 days before Brenda's brutal murder, a store clerk at Miller's Market had reported seeing a man, mid-30s, cap pulled low over his face, standing near the entrance to the parking lot. He hadn't entered the store, parked a car, or interacted with anyone, which immediately struck the clerk as odd. For the first time in months, the detectives had something resembling a pattern, and this mysterious man became their focal point. Building the profile. The task ahead wasn't easy, narrowing in on a person with no name who left no trace but appeared just long enough to leave an impression on those who crossed his path. The investigative team began combing through security footage from every location linked to the murders, even if most of it was grainy and incomplete. Neither Miller's Market nor Julie's bank had robust camera systems, but Howard and King pored over what little footage they had, obsessively replaying blurry images of parking lots and streets. Days bled into nights, the investigators struggling to match a figure to the vague descriptions. It felt like trying to pin a shadow to the wall. Then, after nearly giving up on an older tape from a hardware store near Julie's apartment, Howard caught something. A single frame of a man wearing a dark cap and jacket, walking briskly away from the direction of the apartments. The footage was time-stamped for the very night Julie was murdered. The image wasn't sharp enough to determine facial features, but the team took note of his height, approximately 5'10" inches to 6'0", and build, slim but broad-shouldered. Adding this to Patricia's and the clerk's descriptions, the team began piecing together a rough portrait. A white male, likely between the ages of 30 and 40, always dressed inconspicuously. Dark cap, plain jacket. A man who blended in so well that people forgot he was there, but whose prolonged presence always lingered just long enough to feel wrong. A dangerous game of cat and mouse. With this new insight, law enforcement began canvassing Edgefield, showing the blurry still frame from the hardware store to anyone who might recognize the man. "Have you seen him before?" became the constant refrain among neighbors, shop owners, and taxi drivers. Predictably, the results were mixed. A few people confessed to seeing someone similar but couldn't provide actionable details, while others simply shrugged, writing him off as just another guy in a cap. Profiler Jack Morrison reminded the team that their suspect wasn't ordinary. "This is a man who knows how to disappear. If these sightings were the only times he was noticed, I promise you, there are countless others where he went unseen. He's not sloppy, he's careful, deliberate. Hunting him won't be about catching him in the act. You're going to have to work harder to find him where he thinks he can't be seen." Though Jack's words offered clarity, they also highlighted the overwhelming challenge. The thermos killer wasn't going to lead them to him. He moved like smoke, present, suffocating but impossible to grasp. A clue from the past. The breakthrough came by accident. During a routine check of cold case files for any incidents remotely resembling Edgefield's murders, Detective King stumbled across a report of a sexual harassment case from 6 years earlier in a neighboring county. The defendant was a laborer named Hank Miller, a man of average build with dark hair and a history of aggression during his earlier employment. Though Miller had never been convicted of serious crimes, multiple complaints about his behavior ranged from stalking to verbal threats against women. "What makes this guy different from a dozen others like him?" Howard asked skeptically when King brought the file to her office. "Take a guess where he used to work," King replied, tossing a thin stack of job history papers onto her desk. Howard's eyes skimmed the page until they stopped cold. "A construction site not 5 blocks from Brenda's school, another near Julie's bank," she read aloud. "And this was back in '94? King nodded somberly. "That dark cap everyone keeps mentioning? A guy like him, he puts in long physical hours. He'd probably wear one every day without thinking about it. The web tightens." Hank Miller wasn't arrested on the spot. The team needed more. But at last, they had narrowed their sights to one man, a local who fit their quietly brewing profile far too well. Howard and King began covert surveillance of Miller, following him to job sites and coffee shops, meticulously documenting his movements. Each new thread only wound the evidence tighter, clean-shaven, quiet, and polite, but with an unnerving habit of standing in place and watching, always just watching. As detectives edged closer, Morrison offered a warning. "This is someone who believes he's untouchable. The second he feels us closing in, he'll snap, escalate, be ready because whatever he has left in him, he's saving it for the end." They didn't know it then, but Morrison was right. Miller's world was already beginning to crack, and the chase was about to come to its violent conclusion. The arrest and interrogation of a killer. By late October 1997, the investigation into the Thermos killer had reached a boiling point. Months of fear and methodical detective work came to a head as law enforcement officers in Edgefield, Ohio finally narrowed their sights on one suspect, Hank Miller, a stoic and shadowy laborer with a history of disturbing behavior and an unnerving ability to disappear into the background. For weeks, Miller had been quietly followed, his movements logged by detectives Lisa Howard and Terry King. They watched as he loitered outside construction sites after his shifts, lingered in grocery store lots, and surveyed streets with an unnatural stillness. Despite their growing certainty, Howard and King knew they couldn't arrest Miller without hard evidence linking him to the murders. That evidence wouldn't come until the discovery of one small, overlooked mistake, a piece of DNA that would strip Miller's anonymity forever. The final thread. It was a single strand of hair found in one of the stainless steel thermoses left beside Julie McNamara's mutilated body, a small, seemingly insignificant detail among the chaos of Julie's murder scene. But modern DNA testing, though still in its relative infancy in the late 90s, provided a way forward for the case. After weeks of processing, the results came in. The DNA in the hair was a match to Hank Miller, locking him to the crime in a way no alibi or perceived innocence could undo. When the confirmation came through, the Edgefield Police Department prepared for an operation that would end the reign of terror the Thermos killer had unleashed on their town. Chief Raymond Holden and FBI profiler Jack Morrison devised a cautious plan for Miller's arrest. "He's going to run or worse," Morrison warned during the pre-briefing. "A man like this doesn't go willingly. He's prepared for this moment in his mind. The question is, how far will he go before we stop him?" The arrest. On a cold October morning, detectives Howard and King, along with a team of uniformed officers, quietly surrounded Miller's home on the outskirts of Edgefield. A modest rental with a cracked porch and overgrown weeds, the house was unassuming, just like Miller himself. But the flicker of blinds shifting inside suggested Miller knew something. Howard issued the command over her radio. "We go in careful. He doesn't think we're coming. He's not going to see it coming, until it's too late." But Hank Miller was always a step ahead. Or at least he believed he was. As soon as officers knocked on his door announcing their presence, a loud crash from the back of the house sent the team into action. "Back door! He's running!" shouted Officer King as he sprinted around to the rear. What followed was a tense foot chase through the twisted woods surrounding Miller's property. Leaves crunched underfoot as Miller, dressed in his usual dark jacket and cap, darted between trees, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. Howard flew after him, adrenaline propelling her faster than she ever thought possible. "I've got visual!" she yelled into her radio. Miller made the mistake of glancing back, just in time for Howard to tackle him to the ground. The force of the impact knocked the cap from his head, exposing sharp, furious eyes that glared at her with what she could only describe as disdain. "It's over, Miller!" she growled, pinning his wrists while King cuffed him. "It's over!" A silent suspect. Back at the station, Miller sat motionless in the interrogation room, a study in defiance. His hands, now roughened by years of labor, lay flat on the metal table, and his eyes seemed to bore into the opposite wall. No anger, no panic, just a quiet, unsettling calm. Detective Lisa Howard had seen intimidation tactics before, but Miller's silence was different. He wasn't combative, he wasn't scared, she recalled later. He was calculated, like he was still trying to figure out what his next move would be, even though the game was over. Profiler Jack Morrison joined the interrogation to break the wall Miller had built around himself. "Hank," Morrison began, his voice steady, calculated, yet strangely sympathetic. "We found the thermoses. We found your DNA. We know what you've been doing. What we don't know is why. But you can tell us. You can control how this ends." For a long moment Miller didn't respond. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he finally spoke, his voice low and almost emotionless. "Control, huh? You think you've got control?" He let out a dry laugh. "You don't know what control looks like." Howard leaned forward. "Why the thermoses, Hank? Why the trophies? Why mutilation? These weren't random, none of this was. You planned every second of it." Miller turned his cold gaze toward her, his lips curling slightly into a smirk. But still, he wouldn't answer. To him, this was an extension of his ritual. The silence was part of his control, and he intended to keep it for as long as possible. The case breaks wide open. Though Miller offered no confessions in the room that day, investigators didn't need his cooperation. The evidence spoke for itself. As the search teams combed through his house, disturbing details began to emerge. In his basement, police discovered meticulously organized stacks of notebooks filled with cryptic drawings, dates, and bizarre calculations. One page in particular captured everyone's attention, a crude sketch of a thermos surrounded by disjointed phrases written in jagged lines: perfection, flawed, balance restored. Inside his garage was more damning evidence: a small, bloodied hammer, gloves with traces of hair and skin still embedded in the fibers, and a small, locked chest. When detectives forced the chest open, they found trophies taken from each victim: Julie McNamara's missing coffee tumbler, Maria Gonzalez's scarf, Brenda Anderson's earrings, and Jason Parker's taxi license, torn into quarters just like the one left in the thermos. Morrison was right. Miller didn't stop until he believed the world had been manipulated to fit his grotesque standards of control. The aftermath. As news of Miller's arrest swept through Edgefield, relief washed over the community like a much-needed rain. People who had spent months barricading their doors at night and living in fear could finally breathe again, but the scars of what he'd done lingered. Families grieved the loved ones they'd lost. Businesses tried to repair their shattered sense of safety. Edgefield, though free of its predator, was forever changed. For Howard, King, and Morrison, the moment of arrest was bittersweet. They caught their man, ended the madness, but Miller's blank expression and his refusal to explain his actions left a haunting emptiness in the victory. He wasn't broken in the way most people think of broken, Morrison said later in a press interview. He was calculated, controlled, and that's what made him so dangerous. Hank Miller would never see the light of day again. His arrest marked the beginning of his trial, one of Ohio's most infamous cases. But for the people of Edgefield, it marked the end of a nightmare that had consumed them for almost a year. Yet, as the dust settled, one question remained. Was Hank Miller always destined to become a monster, or had the world built him, piece by piece, until he could no longer contain the darkness? The trial and the sentencing. The trial of Hank Miller, better known by the haunting moniker the Thermos Killer, captivated not just the state of Ohio, but the entire nation. By the winter of 1997, Edgefield had transitioned from a quiet, unassuming town into a hotbed of media frenzy, and the courthouse became the epicenter for a community finally ready to face the man who had turned their lives into a living nightmare. For the families of Brenda Anderson, Maria Gonzalez, Jason Parker, and Julie McNamara, the courtroom was a place of reckoning, a stage where questions that had lingered for months would finally be addressed. For the prosecutors, it was the culmination of relentless work, countless late nights, and the weight of ensuring justice was served. For Hank Miller, it was something else entirely, a place where his eerie silence, which had persisted since his arrest, was met with the piercing light of truth for the first time. A trial of epic proportions dubbed the trial of the decade. By newspapers, Hank Miller's court proceedings attracted relentless national attention. Every network clamored for access, their cameras stationed outside the courthouse while journalists fought over seats in the packed gallery. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Edgefield were transformed into a media circus overnight, with satellite vans parked outside diners and reporters swarming local residents looking for a soundbite. Inside the courthouse, the prosecution was led by Angela Trent, a seasoned district attorney unafraid to go toe-to-toe with defense teams. Personally committed to delivering justice, Trent had reviewed every scrap of evidence with meticulous care. "We have a mountain of evidence," she confidently told her team the night before opening statements. "We'll make him answer for everything." The defense, granted by the state after Miller professed his inability to afford legal representation, was an overworked public defender named Chris Donovan. Cynical by nature but diligent to a fault, Donovan openly stated to the media, "I didn't take this case because I believed my client was innocent. I took it because everyone deserves their day in court, even monsters." The prosecution laid out its case systematically. Over the course of 4 weeks, witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors, co-workers of the victims, and the detectives who finally brought Miller to justice. Crime scene photos, the now infamous stainless steel thermoses, the bloodied hammer from Miller's home, and the DNA from the hair left behind were all presented in painstaking detail. For many in the gallery, including the families of the victims, it was an excruciatingly painful process, a fresh reminder of how coldly calculated Miller's actions had been. As each piece of evidence was revealed, the gallery frequently gasped. The sketches found in Miller's basement of his perfect thermos were particularly chilling. "This wasn't just murder," Trent declared during her summation. "This was obsession. This was domination. This was a man who believed he could turn human lives into objects to satisfy his psychotic need for control." The families take the stand. One of the most emotional moments of the trial arrived when the victims' families were asked to testify about the loved ones they had lost. Brenda Anderson's mother, Celia, took the stand clutching her daughter's class photo. "She loved teaching," Celia said, her voice shaking. "She loved children. She deserved to watch her own children grow up one day. But Hank Miller shattered that dream. He extinguished her light, and he didn't even care." Maria Gonzalez's sister, Anita, delivered a searing rebuke, staring directly at Miller as she spoke. "You think you're some kind of genius," she said through gritted teeth. "You're not. You're just a coward who hides behind his rituals because you don't want to face your own pathetic existence." Julie McNamara's father, a stoic man known for his composed demeanor, broke down after recounting the last conversation he'd had with his daughter. "She just wanted to help people," he said, tears streaming down his face. "That's the kind of person she was. And you robbed us of her kindness. You robbed the world of her kindness." Miller's reaction, blank as ever. Hank Miller, throughout the trial, remained as impenetrable as ever. His expression stayed frozen, silent, staring straight ahead. His lack of emotion rattled everyone present. He never even flinched, one juror would later admit. Even when we showed him the crime scene photos, it was like he wasn't even there. Prosecutor Angela Trent seized on Miller's demeanor. "Look at him," she said during her closing arguments, pointing toward the defense table where Miller sat unmoving. "Not once has he shown remorse. Not once has he flinched. This is a man consumed by control, incapable of empathy, incapable of humanity. Anything less than the ultimate punishment is an insult to the lives he stole." The defense's strategy. Chris Donovan, the defense attorney, faced an uphill battle from the start. His strategy relied heavily on painting Miller as mentally unfit, a man plagued by psychological illness so severe he could not comprehend the full weight of his actions. Expert witnesses were brought in to discuss Miller's suspected antisocial personality disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies tied closely to his methodical crimes. Miller's actions weren't those of a sane man, Donovan argued. Yes, what he did was horrific, yes, it was monstrous, but it was also the product of a mind twisted by years of trauma and distorted thinking. A death sentence in this case is vengeance, not justice. But Donovan's arguments did little to sway the jury. One juror, recalling her experience in deliberation, said simply, "He wasn't insane, he was evil, there's a difference." The verdict. On November 19th, after nearly 5 hours of careful deliberation, the jury announced their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood, his voice steady as he delivered the words everyone had been holding their breath to hear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Hank Miller, guilty of all charges." Cheers and sobs erupted from the gallery, forcing the judge to slam his gavel repeatedly to restore order. For the victims' families, it was a moment of bittersweet justice. "Nobody wins here," said Jason Parker's widow, clutching a worn photo of her late husband. "But at least now, he can't hurt anyone else." The sentencing. The sentencing phase of the trial moved swiftly. On December 3rd, the judge handed down the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. His words were unsparing as he addressed Miller directly. "Your crimes were deliberate. They were cruel beyond comprehension. You terrorized an entire community, but above all you stole the most precious thing we have, life. For that, the court sentences you to death by lethal injection." Once again, Miller didn't react, not a tremor, not a flicker of emotion. For a man whose actions had brought countless tears and broken hearts, he remained as blank as the cold thermoses he'd left behind. Closure for Edgefield. As the trial concluded, Edgefield began its slow journey toward healing. The town, though forever scarred, found solace in the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Local businesses reopened, children played freely at the park again, and locks that had been bolted tightly for nearly a year were loosened, if only slightly. For Chief Holden, Detective Howard, and FBI profiler Jack Morrison, the trial's conclusion was relief, wrapped in exhaustion. "We stopped him," Howard said at a quiet post-trial gathering with her team. "That's what matters. None of us are ever going to forget what happened here, but at least we stopped him." The lingering question. Hank Miller was transferred to death row, where he now sits, awaiting his execution. Yet for every answer the trial provided, some questions still linger. Why did Miller target his particular victims? Were there more murders left undiscovered? And what truly drove him to commit such methodical, horrifying acts? As the town of Edgefield moves forward, Miller's silence remains one final maddening puzzle. Proof that even in justice, some mysteries may never fully be solved.